Welcome, everyone. Did everyone have a good lunch? Very good. I'll try to speak in a very monotone voice, so you can all just kind of doze off here. We all know this is the after lunch session, so I'll try not to keep anyone awake today. First of all, a big thank you to our sponsors, making it possible for us to be here. I think the 7th time, but I might be off. So big thank you to the sponsors. For those of you who don't know, my name is Jaap Brasser. Today is a special presentation for me because I used to work together with Mike for about 4 years. We'd been talking about doing a session together, and during those 4 years, we never managed to do so. Mostly because Mike is too cool for me, but he'll introduce himself.
Hi, everybody. I'm Mike Preston. This is my first time here as a speaker, my first time here as an attendee, so I'm super excited. And like Jaap said, I had the chance to work with Jaap for 3 or 4 years at Rubrik and learn from him and everything, so I'm really excited to be on stage with him. He has also fixed my little Canadian flag. They put an American one on me, so I raised a stink and I got Canada back on there, and that's where I'm from. If you haven't figured that out yet, I don't think I have that much of an accent, but we'll find out. Find out.
Cool. So we have a pretty simple agenda. It's mostly going to be focused about demos, not too many slides. So that should be good or bad, depending on your perspective there. So we're going to split it up in 2 sections. I'll cover determining your audience. So who do you actually write this module, this API wrapper for? Talk a bit about auto-generating versus doing the artisanal approach of handcrafting your functions and commandlets. And some of the issues that you can get with 2FA, a bit of unit testing and documentation and why it matters.
Yeah, and from there, I'll go into sort of backwards compatibility and versioning, because we all know we can't trust the API developers to provide us with APIs that have non-breaking changes all the time. I'll talk a little bit about some lessons learned around custom view definitions and sort of what happened to us when we implemented them. And then that kind of flows into having custom module options and being able to sort of set things up for the modules and have users sort of, tailor them specifically to how they want them to perform. That makes sense.
So about a module, can you tell us a bit about what it is and what you do?
Sure, yeah, because we're going to be using the Rubrik SDK for PowerShell sort of as our example. It's the module that Jaap sort of headed up there and we've worked on together. And just to give you a little bit of a background as to what it is, Rubrik's a data protection company. We do backups of all the players, and basically the PowerShell module is just an interface into that to do things like take backups of VMware virtual machines, Hyper-V virtual machines, all the clouds, things like that. So it's a pretty basic concept in terms of how it works, but just so you have that sort of background as to when we start saying, we connect to a cluster, it's connecting to a Rubrik cluster, which is connecting to the backup service and different things.
And you connect to the cluster through a RESTful API, correct?
Through a RESTful API, yep.
Sweet. So first of all, I'll go into what the advantage is that PowerShell brings. So what we wanted to do when creating this module, we wanted it to be possible for different users to be able to connect to and make use of the API. PowerShell has great structured output, makes it easy to filter things. So we want to make sure that everything that was output was actual PowerShell objects and properly typed PowerShell objects. We didn't go for classes. There's benefits, there's challenges, but I found that there was more challenges by implementing classes than benefits. We want to remove the need for direct API calls, so build the functions that abstract that away for our end users, so they don't have to think about what which API endpoints to call and how to call them, because the API endpoints can be finicky, and it's very nice when you're really involved in your product and you know exactly what every API endpoint does, but you can't expect your end users to have that level of knowledge. So for that reason, we wanted to remove the need for direct API calls. Furthermore, we want to implement session management, so you could be connected to multiple clusters or combinations of clusters and be able to work with that. So developing modules in general, there's a number of challenges there. So being able to work together as a team on a single project is challenging on its own, because you need to be able to enable your team and have all the resources available for, in my case, for Mike to be able to work on a PowerShell project as well. Did you work on a lot of PowerShell projects before working on this one?
Quite a few. No module development or anything, but quite a few scripting at the scripting and automation at the organization I was with prior to that.
So one of the first things we did was make sure that there was good contribution guidelines, and that also ties into the open source management, having clear guidelines of what is expected when you contribute something. Something that's important, for example, is actually including unit tests and having proper documentation, because documentation will really help out your end users get started. So at a minimum, there should be sensible unit tests, not just any kind of unit test, because it's very easy to make unit tests that will always pass and don't really test anything.
I will say you can't slip a PR past Jaap without a unit test. He flags it every time.
Yes. And other challenges are APIs. It's nice when they work as expected, but there's going to be bugs. It can be interesting, because at some point you end up becoming so knowledgeable in the APIs that you can tell the developers that created the API that there's bugs there. And they always took this advice really to heart, and they immediately fixed anything we gave them. Unfortunately, we live in the real world, and that was not the case. And then also the challenge with new API versions. I won't go too much in depth, because Mike will go over that. And then we get to determining your audience, aka I needed to have a slide with some animals in there. Does anyone know what the animal on your left is, my right? Quokka, yes. we do love quokkas. So to give a bit of an idea of the kind of people that we had interacting with the product. So the quokka is the cute but clueless project manager that has an idea of what's going on, but mostly just bumbles around and is just very cute and occasionally obnoxious when they're asking what's the status, what the status. In the middle, we have our IT operation folks, very confidently driving around, and on the right we have our developers that are actually very in depth in how they interact with our product and with our APIs. So what we did for our PowerShell integration was mainly focus on the middle group here, the IT operations, the backup operators, and to give them a good interactive experience and a true PowerShell experience. Is that correct?
Yeah, that seems bang on.
Well, perfect. And with that, I'll go into some of the examples of what we did with our documentation. Let's see. Nice, it's still there. So unfortunately, I know that the guidelines are that this should be light mode, but we had a last-minute laptop swap, so and I couldn't figure out how to get it into light mode. So if anyone knows in the audience how you make it light mode when you're not signed in, otherwise this is going to be the way we do things. So as mentioned, one of the things we made sure of, let me see if it's big enough in the back. Joe, can you see this? Is Joe still here? Can you read it bigger? So we can see that the bare minimum we wanted was to have sure that there is a synopsis, a description. There had to be online documentation, which we also provided there. And there needed to be examples. So this is a very simple command. It didn't actually have any parameters, so it could only be executed in one way. But then if we go into the documentation, we made sure to automatically generate all the documentation by creating MD files. And in combination with either something like GitHub Pages or Gitbook, it's possible to host this online and to have a good experience. And the advantage that this brings is when people are using just Get Help, they get all the help information. But there's also Get Help Dash online, and it just makes it a lot easier for people to be able to search through and to find the resources they need there. And then on the other end of the spectrum, I did mention that we also cater to our developers. So we also made sure to include developer documentation. So to also introduce the concept of all the different API versions that Mike will be talking about in his part. You can see that we have version 8 here, version 7, and also we have V1, V2, V3, and internal. So one of the key components of our API structure was that we want to make sure that there are no breaking changes within an API version. So whenever an API endpoint was updated, it would be moved from V1 to V2 to V3 and eventually V4, but we're not there yet, or you're not there yet. And the nice thing about it is that it's all based on an API spec, and it makes it very easy to automatically generate documentation. So what we can see here, that is very big. What we can see here is that there's also examples of how we can use these endpoints and also what kind of payloads you can put into the endpoints. If we would go to a specific one, what we can see is which parameters are mandatory, what kind of values are expected. So this is more the developer side of documentation that we provided there. And with that, let's see if we get it back. I'll hand it over to you, Mike.
All right. I don't even need PowerPoint right now, do I?
I
don't think so. It's the same slide, demos. Okay, so I mentioned I'm going to talk about a few things. First being backwards compatibility. As Jaap said there, as the developers made changes to the APIs, they'd graduate from internal to V1, then V1 to V2. That way people could consume these and have some sort of backwards compatibility, and there wouldn't be any breaking changes at all. However, when they did that, what would happen is obviously the URI or the endpoint that we're trying to connect to would change. So for instance, if we're getting a list of VMs, it might be v1/VM for version 5 of the product, and version 6 comes out. Now all of a sudden it's /v2/VM. So we needed to accommodate a way to integrate this into the PowerShell module in order to not have to add new commandlets or do a whole bunch of tests or things like that. So I'm just going to kind of jump into the module and show you how we did that. I'll just connect into a cluster now. So basically what I did is I just connected there, and then what happens is we assign this global variable, and we can see, zoom in some more. More? All right. till I'm uncomfortable, right? Isn't that how it works? Yeah. Okay, so you can see now we have a version stored in that global variable, so we know what version of the software that we're connected to. So that's kind of how we drive where we're going to go get all of that API information. And in a private function within the module, we have, it's called get Rubrik API data. And essentially what it is, and I'll just try and drag this down a bit so we can see, it's a great big giant hash table, and we can see each commandlet that we have, as well as the version of the software, the minimum version that it supports, and then all the information for that commandlet. So what API endpoint to connect to, what method we're using, if we need to query anything within the query parameters, if we need to filter out the result, and different things like that. So if I do, I'll find one that actually has a couple different ones. So here's get Rubrik SLA. This is essentially the backup information. That's how we grab that. We can see at minimum version 1.0, we go to API/v1/SLA domain, and then we have a whole bunch of different information here that we're storing as well. And then in version 5.0 of the product, we all of a sudden now we're going to API/v2/SLA_domain. So by doing this, we're able to, within the actual commandlets themselves.
And how does it determine which version of the API to use?
How does what determine?
How do we know which version to use?
It's stored in that global variable.
Very good.
So we have that information. This is 8.0. It goes and finds the minimum version before that. So what we do here is then, we go ahead and call that, we store that in resources, and then we can use that all throughout the commandlet to, determine things like the URI and what needs to go into the queries and into the body and everything like that. So that essentially allows us to, and I'll show an example of that. If we actually run that command, we can see in the verbose output that it's selected the 5.0 API data for this commandlet because I'm connected to an 8.0 cluster. So if I was connected to a version 4 cluster, it would default back to the 1.0 and call the correct endpoint that way. So by storing all that in a big hash table, it gives us an easy way to sort of move along as the developers make changes to the API, and then all of a sudden our SDK isn't breaking, and we can have one SDK that supports all the versions of the Rubrik product. The second thing I want to talk about is view definitions, and I'll just run this commandlet here, which is going to go ahead and grab information about a virtual machine. We can see it contains, it returns a number of properties and things. And this is how the module was originally developed, and things were working great. It's a lot of information though. So, Jaap and I had a talk and we decided, we're going to start implementing some of the custom view definitions. So basically the PS1 XML files. So if I go, I think we have some here. We can take a look. We did it for, various objects. So we basically just defined, what information we think it should return, bare minimum and show to the user. And we did this, and we can see the result of that. Right, so now we're getting bare minimum information, and we thought it was a good idea, and I think it is. But the problem was, it's a good idea if you actually start out that way. If you have a bunch of users that are used to seeing a long list of properties returned, and then all of a sudden you hammer this on them, there was quite a few, support tickets and issues being filed saying, hey, I don't see the is_relic anymore. Why did you guys remove the is_relic? Even though it is there, it's just not showing it. So we had to walk a lot of people through, being able to, pipe it to select and select the is_relic, or just, if you store it in a variable, just go like vm.isRelic. So a lot of people thought information was gone when it wasn't. So that was sort of, I would say, not necessarily a mistake, but something I think we should have done probably right from the get-go if we were going to implement that. Which kind of leads me into the next sort of thing, which is being able to customize and give users the ability to customize their module option, like different module options. So essentially how we did this was we placed a file, and if we look at we placed a file into the user's home directory. So we created this sync Rubrik options file, which essentially placed a JSON file into the user's home directory, which basically looked like this. So we have this sits as a template within the module, and every time the module gets imported, it checks to see if one's there, if one is there. If one isn't there, then it crams just the template file down onto the machine. We did this to allow, well, the first thing was to allow users to turn off those custom view definitions. So if I jump back into VS Code here, I can kind of show how that works. So there's a number of commandlets we build around it, but you do have the ability to sort of take a look at those module options that you have. And then, we can go ahead here and say, we're going to turn off the ability to apply the custom view definitions. And then when we get that VM now, that same VM, we're going to go right back to that default behavior. So a lot of this was just sort of developed to allow our users to go back to the way the module worked for them. So it's back to that, what they're used to. Another option that we threw in there was the ability to specify a credential path. So you could essentially, point them to an encrypted file there, which holds their credentials to log into the actual cluster. And then if I just disconnect, and then reconnect. Essentially, now I don't have to specify my credentials. It just goes and imports them from that credential file. So it's really handy for someone who's working on their machine and working in PowerShell all the time and working with the module that they're connecting to all the time, so they don't have to do things like that. And then there was the ability to sort of set default parameters as well. So we can even go one step further here and say, like when I look at the last, I had to specify a server. Maybe I only had one cluster or one product that I'm connecting to. I don't want to have to type that in every time. I can go ahead and just set that default parameter for server. And then I'll disconnect just to make sure things are working. Now I don't have to basically specify anything within my connect commandlet. So those default parameters could be used for anything. It's just the built-in default parameter stuff with PowerShell. So yeah, another big option one was if you had multiple clusters, a lot of times we'd always require them to say, oh, the primary server, the primary cluster I want to connect to is the one that I specified, which, if we typed in local there, you could set that as a default parameter and just move on. And I think that's the end. Oh, I can delete the JSON. We can see back in here now that I've turned some of that stuff on, all that information sync back into that JSON file or that module option file. So with that, kind of just to sum up everything, we got some do's and don'ts, which are...
Do you want to do the first do?
No, you do the do.
Oh,
I'll do the don'ts.
So with the documentation, we found that the most important thing was to have examples and have examples that people would actually use. So not just, oh, this is how you get the information, but we focused on the interactive part as well. And that's also what we tried to do was to make sure that that the commands would be able to be piped into each other. So when gathering information about a VM, you would be able to pipe that into an SOA and it would just work as you would expect with a PowerShell command. So we made sure to include those examples as well. And the more examples, the better. Some commands didn't require a lot. Others, we have up to 12 13 examples for a single command.
Yeah, so my don't would be don't trust your API developers when they say we don't introduce any breaking changes, because there is that odd time that they obviously do. And a lot of times working on the PowerShell module, we were the ones that found the API bugs first, because we're trying to develop new commandlets around things. And as soon as we're the ones that see those API changes and those breakages first. So you can't really trust them to version things properly. You got to take your own steps and build that into your modules yourself to handle some of that stuff.
Yeah, and to go a bit further on that, part of what we did is we built out a framework that would test out the new API spec against the old API spec, and we would be able to list out all the differences with a giant pester test, and it would come back with a lot more than that was actually inside of the changelog. And when they said, no, we didn't do any breaking changes. We never touched that. No, but we made these fields mandatory, so your commands don't work anymore. So there's some challenges. It says here, don't trust your API developers. I would go a step further. Just don't trust anyone. So for the do's, unit testing, but make it sensible unit testing, because when I got started and made unit tests mandatory, we'd started to get unit tests where people were just testing the parameters. Is the parameter actually mandatory? Those kind of tests. And that's not really a valid unit test. So as a part of that, we wrote out both example pester tests for the most common functions that we had. And on top of that, we just flat out rejected pull requests that came in without proper unit tests.
Yeah, and the final don't mess with your default views. We kind of learned this the hard way. While the data's still there, people get so used to seeing what they see within the product that as soon as things change, they're like, well, this is gone and that's gone. And you're like, well, no, it's still there. If you still kind of search through it or use your dot and type that property in, you'll get the information you're looking for. It's sad, because it was definitely, I don't know if you saw, that was one VM that had, probably, I don't know how many properties were in it, 50 or 60 properties. When you're returning 2,000 of those, it gets really messy really fast. And the default views make it really nice, and, especially with the default return from the commandlet. But don't mess with your default views, or you're going to end up, having to build more commandlets around setting up those module options and allowing people to go back and forth and turn it off and on.
And I think before you move on, one of the things that we also noticed is obviously a lot of our users were still using PowerShell version 5, and I think most of us were developing on PowerShell Core at the time, later just PowerShell. And invoke web request and invoke REST method are hugely improved in later versions of PowerShell. So we also found out the limitations when it comes to Unicode characters. And when you are working for a global company with a lot of international customers, you're going to run into that issue eventually. So in order to resolve that, we also created specific unit tests, and I just littered our entire test environment with databases with Unicode characters and smileys and unicorns, just to be able to test that it would work in all scenarios. And it was painful to implement properly in PowerShell 5. I think I spent a week understanding the implementation of invoke web request there, just to be in order to be able to reverse engineer that and get it working on older versions of PowerShell as well.
Yeah, and that was another module option that we had to tackle, was the request timeout for invoke web request, and allowing some users to change that to a higher value if they needed to. So,
yeah, because if you have thousands of objects coming back, it could really take a long time to just be able to download that, especially with wonky VPN links between sites. And
yeah, and it's hard to say, what, it worked fine for us with our 5 objects in our test environment. What you talking about? So I think that's all we have, but we got lots of time for questions. 15 minutes exactly.
Yes.
When you decide to store set some default values, where did you decide to store them?
So the question is, when we decided to store default values, where did we store them? So you mean the default view, the custom view definition?
No, you meant like the server, you don't have to mention anymore. You can collect
So the question is, where did we store the defaults? We just stored it in the what was it again?
This is $home, like the user's home directory. Well, the default parameters. Oh, they're stored in that module options JSON file as well. So if you set any default parameters, if you set them up, the next time you import that module, it'll look inside that JSON file in the user's home directory and then kind of re-push them back up into your new session.
Yep.
How do you fix the problem with the Unicode character?
So the question is, how do we fix the problem with the Unicode character? So on PowerShell 6 and up, we didn't have to do anything because it just worked there. I can go into the code. Do you have the module open? I can show it on screen.
Yeah. I actually would just wanted to... I'm pretty sure... Oh, I don't have your... I don't know if it's going to work. I was trying to show all your crazy database names that you had.
Let's see.
Down, right there.
There we go. So it was one of our private functions where we did this. And I think it's in invoke Rubrik web requests. Make this one small. And so we would test which version of PowerShell we were on. And let's see where we do this. Maybe it was invoke submit request. Here we do it. So what we did was instead of just taking the output that we got from that we got back. So just we have the result in webresult.content, but this one only displayed ASCII characters. So none of the Unicode characters on PowerShell 5. So here is where we fixed that. So we use system encoding and we get the raw content stream that we got back from invoke web request on PowerShell 5 in order to get the Unicode out. Another issue that we also had was that the JSON unwrapping that PowerShell 5 does is suboptimal at best. So we wrote our own JSON unfolder. The downside of that was that it worked fine up to a couple thousand objects, but for the really large objects, it became extremely slow. So there were some performance issues that we ended up having to fix there because we had our own JSON unfolder there. Does that answer your question? Cool. Yep. Yeah. Okay, so the question is regarding authentication, where's the token stored? So at the time, the secrets management module didn't exist yet. So what we were using was we just did export COI XML, and we just stored that file, and you could give the path to that file. So if you're on a Windows-based system, it's encrypted using EFS, I think. So only your user account is able to decrypt that file. It's not the most secure way. Using Azure Key Vault is a better approach these days, but that's how we implemented it at the time.
Questions from the previous one.
Yep.
How about using UTF-32?
So. So the question is if we also considered using UTF-32 instead of UTF-8 that we used. I didn't do any testing with that. This one resolved the issue. So it decoded it properly, and we got the Unicode characters and all the special characters. So I didn't do any research, or at least I don't remember if I did any research to the different encoding methods. Yes?
What advice would you give if anyone is trying to do this and it's not for company's API? How would this be different for somebody trying to work on this for a public school or a company?
So the question is, if you're doing this and you're doing it for an API that is not of your company and you're not in contact with the development team. Mike, you want to take that one?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I don't think any of the advice would actually change, to be honest. As long as you have API documentation that you know the public tool's giving you or the public API is giving you, you know, I would probably take the same route. It's probably even more important for things like backwards compatibility and versioning because, you know, you won't have sort of that inside view into that stuff. So they can make major changes and, you know, being able to easily, you know, store a lot of that stuff in hash tables and abstract all that away from the end users is probably a good thing. So I don't think anything would really change at all.
No, I've built on external APIs as well, and I would what I would do differently is because I don't know when their API changes, so I would just have a set of pester tests to just run against the API endpoints just to see that I'm still getting the information that I'm expecting to get back. So I would at least get alerted myself when it stops working. So just have a daily task or a weekly task that runs and automatically creates an issue on your GitHub repo that so you can confirm if it's still working. Yes. So the question is, did we consider adding a switch to our commands for the custom view definitions to override it, so we wouldn't have to pipe into select? I did not consider it.
It sounds like a great idea, though. Yeah, in hindsight, yeah.
It's all open source.
No, honestly, you know, looking back, it did sort of open up that module options thing for us as well. So, you know, while there was some sort of disadvantages to it, it did provide some benefits to the module, I think, overall. But yeah, no, that's another option we could have went.
I think our intent was to make the output from the module similar to the output you had in the web interface of the product, and that seemed like a good idea. But since the people were already used to interacting with it in the way they were used to it, it was challenging, and we should have probably had a focus group or given it to some of our champions and just see, like, do you actually like this? And then they probably would have said no.
It was interesting. It was only the people on the actual console, like doing it live, that had an issue. Like the scripts, everybody's scripts still worked. Everything still worked. But they were like, it's all gone. And I'm like, well, how are your scripts still running then? But
we also covered it in our presentation. Mike called it don't trust the API developers, but just don't trust the developers because they break stuff. And I think we proved that.
yeah.
Yes.
So the question was, do we have any advice on, sorry, what was that again? Yeah. Yeah, so the question is, do we have any references around like the disconnects and things? And we do, you know, return information when we disconnect, the 200 value that deletes the session, if that's what you're asking. Or are you asking more along the lines, did we reference any other modules when building this one?
I can take
Yeah,
this
sure.
one because
Yeah.
so the question is, when did we take into consideration when we wanted to output something? Initially, it was kind of all over the place, and some of the commands don't return anything. So when disconnecting, it wouldn't return anything. So we actually, what we did was, whenever something doesn't return anything, we just return a PowerShell object that contains the status code of the command completing with a success message. And success or failure was not based on the was based on the status code, and that is also defined in inside the big hash table that Mike showed. So initially, no, it wasn't the case that every command gave output, but we retroactively added that in because we thought there should always be some kind of output. So if a command outputted nothing, then we just gave the web status. So I think we have 4 minutes left. Question in the back. Because a lot of our customers, the operational folks did not have the permissions. Not all servers were up to date with PowerShell 5. PowerShell 6 was only just out, so there was only PowerShell 6. So by saying only PowerShell 6 at that time would have been a bit of a stretch. So I pushed back against supporting against officially supporting PowerShell version 3 because that was still the case when I started working on this project. So I said 5 we can do because then at least the most common version of PowerShell is supported, and I still see a lot of people on PowerShell 5 these days. So there was more that we didn't have much of a choice because we had such a big customer base, and the idea was to be able to serve them better and give them the tools to work with our product rather than trying to push to the latest and greatest. All right, well then I have one question for all of you. Can you look very excited as me and Mike are going to take a selfie? I mean, it goes both ways, of course. I mean, is this the most excited? Can we get like a...
All right.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much. Enjoy the conference.
Thank you.